90+% of people in the United States, and this is a global epidemic, have metabolic dysfunction. I'm going to go build a company where I create access to these devices for other people. Here's the next thing, here's the next thing. And we do it over time so that people can keep feeling engaged. We generate roughly 30% of our revenue in a month through partnerships, roughly 30% through Lifecycle. And then word of mouth is anywhere from 20 to 30% in a month. As soon as you start engaging with our content, you're sort of like part of the ecosystem. You're part of Levels.
What is the future of consumer marketing?
I think the future of marketing is this idea of people like us do things like this, where you're trying to cater to these smaller audiences.
Now, Ben, I'm super excited to have you on the show today. And I'm excited because I've used Levels and I think you're just doing an incredible job there. And I do have something that I can really compare this against. About 4 to 5 years ago, I managed to convince my doctor to prescribe me a glucose monitor, which at the time didn't feel very easy to do, but managed to get them to give me one. And I got my hardware, and the hardware was fine, but the software, the app that they wanted me to use was just horrible. It felt like something that was invented or developed in the 90s and hadn't evolved since. A friend of mine recommended I try out Levels. I did, and it was a completely different customer journey. It really felt much more like an Apple buying experience, an Apple user experience, than a traditional healthcare experience. So I want to start there. Talk to us about the focus on customer experience at Levels.
You hit the nail on the head that the consumer experience of medical devices in general, sort of medical home healthcare products, tends to be pretty stagnant and clinical. And so we're not classified as a medical company. We're very much a health and wellness company, and we build software on top of these products that exist in the market. And so the more that you can make the experience so that it is more of a consumer experience and it is in line with what people have for expectations, especially with all the wearables, all the devices, all the things that we get used to as far as having these consumer experiences, the more that you can make that the status quo, I think the better off you are at sort of like cracking that market, especially because we're trying to make a market. We're trying to build a market from scratch, as opposed to come in and just say, cool, we're going to build a better mousetrap, kind of like Yeti did, right? The cooler market existed and they did it all on quality of product, brand, and they were able to sort of like build their way into that market that existed. But for us, it's open field. And so we need to be calculated about the decisions we make as we try to build this market here.
And then how do you define the market? Is it metabolic health? Is it continuous glucose monitoring? What is that market that you're building here?
We consider ourselves a metabolic health company, a holistic metabolic health company. And so we build the software on top of continuous glucose monitors. For anyone who's not familiar, you might have heard that term, or CGMs. They're these little devices that go on the back of your arm, and they read your glucose in real time. And so your glucose, as people know, your glucose or your blood sugar, that is your main fuel source or energy source for your body. So that is the only molecule that you can monitor in real time right now. There are other things that need to be taken into consideration for metabolic health, which is all these other markers that we get through labs or through blood tests. And so you might see somebody who says, cool, I've got really stable glucose. I'm doing great. And that would be sort of like looking at the gas gauge of your car and be like, it's full. My car is awesome. But you could have like every check engine sensor on, or your oil pressure could be super high, or you get the point, right? Without tracking these other markers through blood tests, you could have very inverse relationships where it's like your glucose appears to be stable, but your insulin's way out, or you've got really high uric acid. And those, overall, your metabolic function, the way your body functions from a biophysical standpoint, that's what you want to proactively get in front of, because illness, sickness, disease, it doesn't happen in a day. You find out about it, but it's been sort of like this 10 or 20 year path in the making. So getting in front of it and having that actionable data and like for people to make their own decisions is what we're working towards building, is this idea where you've got data at your fingertips so you can make your own choices based on what your body is doing metabolically.
When I first got my Levels, I showed it to my brother-in-law and he has diabetes, and he was like, Brett, that's nothing special. That's been around for a long time. So I think what's so interesting about the Levels product and the Levels journey here is the fact that the product has existed for a very long time, but it was really just focused on people with diabetes. What you're doing is really taking that product and you're bringing that to the masses, or the masses of people who are interested in improving their metabolic health.
Yeah, I mean, glucose tracking, glucose monitors have been like the de facto tool in the type 1 and type 2 market for let's say 20 years. Dexcom is one of the larger players in the space, as is Abbott, and they both have been around for a long time. Dexcom started in the early 2000s, and many people might not know this, but Dexcom by market cap, if you consider them a health and wellness company in the sort of, I wouldn't call them the startup space, but when you start to compare Dexcom compared to the brands that we know, Ro, 23andMe, the list goes on, Dexcom is a $53 billion market cap company. And so you start to realize like they're 10 times larger than the largest companies, or in the case of 23andMe, like 100 times larger in market cap than these brands that we think as being sort of synonymous with health and wellness. And so these monitors have been around for a while, and we're not necessarily trying to democratize them, but what we're saying is that 90+% of people in the United States, and this is a global epidemic, have metabolic dysfunction. And the majority of the people that have metabolic dysfunction aren't even aware of it. And so you're looking at it and you're going, there's a very finite percentage of the population that are actually metabolically healthy. And the only way you know it is like you can see somebody who might be pretty toned and look fit, but they could have metabolic dysfunction of some kind. They could have markers that are way out. And so we've got these inaccurate mental models of what it means to be healthy. We look at people based on what they eat, based on how much they exercise, and we go, you're good. They could be based strictly on statistics. They could be in the majority of people who do have some form of metabolic dysfunction. And again, it's a scale. It's not like, it's not a binary thing where it's like you have it or you don't. You can have it, but you can have insulin that is way higher than maybe somebody that's just a little bit out of range. And that's obviously, that's something that people would want to take pretty seriously if you see your insulin's pretty high, because it shows that you're insulin resistant, and there are all these downstream implications to being insulin resistant and having different forms of metabolic dysfunction.
As a marketer, I'm a big fan of this idea of movement marketing or creating movements, and that's definitely what it feels like is happening here. You know, what's interesting though is it's not just coming from Levels, it's coming from all over the place. So in my household, my wife reads the book or loves the book, The Glucose Goddess. Andrew Huberman, he's always talking about metabolic health. I feel like every dinner I go on with other founders, they're all talking about metabolic health. So it really feels like something is happening here. Can you take us behind the scenes? You know, what is kickstarting this movement and how is it progressing?
I think the movement sort of all happened simultaneously. Everyone has had different input into it. The way Levels started was Josh Clementi was founder of Levels. He was working at SpaceX at the time, and he's told this story on many podcasts, but it's a great one to recall, where he started feeling he was eating what he thought was healthy and he was exercising regularly. He wasn't feeling great. Like he really he felt like he was sick, but he couldn't understand like what was wrong. His sleep was pretty sporadic, just given that it was a high burn environment that he was in. And so he started to, one day he had read this paper from Dom D'Agostino, who's now one of our advisors. Josh worked on life support systems at SpaceX, and Dom had talked about the ketogenic diet and how that in rats had helped to increase longevity. And so Josh sort of like started putting these pieces together, and he's like, maybe this has something to do with my nutrition. He did more research, realized that it might have to do with his blood sugar. And so he started tracking his blood sugar with finger pricks and doing it in a spreadsheet. So this is many moons ago. This was would this be 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. So he was tracking it, and he couldn't actually this is where his pain point came from, is he went to his doctor and he's like, hey doc, can I get a CGM? And the doctor's like, no, you don't have diabetes. Like, I'm not going to prescribe this device to you. And Josh couldn't figure it out in his head, where he's like, I can go to the pharmacy and get finger sticks, like get Lancet with the little like strips, to the test strips to check my blood sugar over the counter, but you won't give me a thing that I can just track it in real time. So that was sort of his frustration point, where he's like, I've figured out this unlock that has made a huge difference in my life, where I'm now able to sort of pinpoint what my blood sugar is doing. And I'm blocked by this. This doesn't make any sense. So it was sort of the chip on his shoulder to say, like, I'm going to go build a company where I create access to these devices for other people. What needs to be true? You need to have a doctor that will prescribe them widely to people based on, they have to meet certain criteria, but based on those criteria, build an app that it actually works with to show you your data in real time, so I don't have to input them into a spreadsheet. And then also use things like food logging, so you can track your food as it relates. So you can find those correlations of, I eat X and then I see Y in my blood sugar. And so that was this like first step into it. So we were pretty early on as far as a company before becoming Levels in June of 2019. But yeah, I think it's that paired with the overall movement of people like Jessie on Chopé is Glucose Goddess. So she's been making an impact. Casey Means, one of the co-founders of Levels, who also has a great book, Good Energy. She's making an impact. Dr. Mark Hyman, Andrew Huberman, Peter Attia, all of these people are creating this movement together. So it's not enough to just say like, yeah, Levels created this market from scratch. It's a lot of people who care about this epidemic and want to make a difference.
And then how are you collaborating with these people? Is there an association? Is there a lobbying group? Or is it more just informal? You all believe in this idea of metabolic health and you're just all working independently to really drive it forward?
There's not necessarily a lobbying group. Everyone loosely knows each other in some way. So we've got, like, we work with Andrew Huberman as a partner. Jesse's been on our podcast. Again, it's you sort of like Mark Hyman's an advisor. You get all of these people that do know each other in some way, shape, or form. And then there are conferences. There are a number of metabolic health conferences. One that Dom D'Agostino, one of our advisors, he helps to organize, is called the Metabolic Health Summit. So everyone's going to these things and talking about everything from how do we get the message out to how do we, you referenced Casey's podcast on Tucker Carlson. I guess that was a week or two ago, but that was a lot around policy change, right? So how do you how do you change policies from the ground up? Because you can't just build a market and say, here it is. There's so many challenges from a policy standpoint that need changing. And so everyone's having these conversations in different ways, shape, or forms. And then they all have different interests where, let's say, David Perlmutter, he's one of our advisors. He's very deep in, same with Rick Johnson. They're both very deep in this idea of uric acid. And uric acid, how does that tie into metabolic health? It's not it is something that we offer through our blood tests is uric acid tracking, but it's, again, it's not sort of like the main thing that people think about when they talk about Levels or metabolic health. Cause right now it's very much CGMs, but we're trying to get people to understand, like, you should care about lactate. You should care about uric acid. You should care about ApoB. Here's why. And the more media that's put out by all these thought leaders, the more people can start to understand it and talk about it amongst themselves, so they can ask their doctors the right questions as well, to come armed with information. So they're not just on the receiving end of some recommendation. They can say, hey, I've been getting blood tests through Levels, or I've been using a CGM. Here's what I'm seeing. What's your outlook on this? The more that people have agency over their own health, the better off they are. Because then you can understand, like, sort of what you should and shouldn't be doing. You can't just take sort of like a prescription or a recommendation as being like the thing you need to do, because you might disagree with it.
Now, going back a little bit to the early marketing strategy, was that original thesis to educate the market, create demand, and then capture the demand?
It really was, hey, let's educate the market. How do we do that? And what are our pillars? So then you start to get down to the channel level and the, we'll call it the conduit. What's the conduit to get that messaging out there? Some of it was partner related. So it's knowing that you need certain partners to spread the message as well. That is an avenue to reach an audience in a way that they trust that thought leader, differently than just saying, cool, we're a company that puts out information, like, trust us. So partners were a big pillar in our strategy. Content was, and then not just distributing that content through this multimedia strategy of saying, how do we generate awareness on YouTube in a different way than our podcast feeds, in a different way than the blog, than social channels, etc. We looked at Lifecycle as being this avenue where we could build an own media audience that we might have their attention in a different way. So we built over time. We're at almost 600,000 people on our email list now, but it's not enough to capture leads and to just be like, cool, we're building an email list. We get open rates on average between 65 and low 80% open rates on our emails, like extremely high, very engaged audience. And this is over time. This has been the trend for 5 years, and it just keeps compounding. So it's not a matter of saying like, oh, that was a point in time and our engagements dropped off. When people sign up for a newsletter or get into our funnel, then we nurture them along through that distribution channel. And we say, hey, it does take some people 1 to 3+ years to convert. And we're okay with that. We just know it's a very long cycle. We're not trying to like ever hard sell people, because it's the education curve is very steep to learn about it, and the timeline is long. Like you can't just snap your fingers and go, I didn't know anything about metabolic health yesterday, and I read this thing and now I feel comfortable. It's like you usually go, wow, I'm overwhelmed but intrigued. I should probably learn more. And that takes time. It's like going through university. You can't just like fast forward your way through a textbook. So it's the strategy is very much create the content, distribute it to people, and do it through channels where you've got an immense amount of trust, and then exercise incredible patience to know that it can take, like, even it was last week sometime, an email came in to Sam from someone who he hadn't talked to since April of 2020. So it took him like 4.5 years to convert.
And then if we look at that revenue breakdown, what percentage is direct? And then what percentage comes from partnerships?
We generate roughly 30% of our revenue in a month through partnerships, roughly 30% through Lifecycle. And then word of mouth is anywhere from 20 to 30% in a month. So those are sort of our 3 big pillars. And that's why Lifecycle is such an important thing for us as our partners. We spend very little on performance marketing in a month. So we spend roughly 5% of our revenue is coming in from performance marketing. The rest is coming in through blog. And it's very, very interesting. So that's where we get that makeup, is it's like 10 to 15% blog, 5% performance marketing, and then sort of say 30, 30, 30, like it's 25, 25, 25. Like you get the point where the numbers sort of match together to get that 100% in a month.
Can you unpack the Lifecycle marketing program and take us a bit deeper?
Lifecycle is a great lever for us. We work with a platform called Drip, which has amazing triggers and logic in it as far as segmentation goes. But every single campaign that we put out is very curated and very nuanced in how we target people. So if somebody comes in through a certain funnel, we make sure that it's not that like smart. It's just somebody's coming in through a certain funnel. Let's say they hit a certain landing page. You want that Lifecycle messaging to not only match that, but to continue on. So it's like, what's the trigger for the message they're going to receive, or the 3 after that? We take people, they'll come in through a funnel, and we tend to put them into a welcome series, which is like a lot of companies do that, where it's like, cool, welcome, here's your first email. And sure, they might drip out other campaigns, but we basically use the welcome series as this, it flexes because we're always sort of A/B testing it, but like 6 to 8 part series where it takes people through Metabolic Health 101, and it just keeps giving them content. And there's basically no selling in that. It's not like, cool, and like buy this thing now. We're just like, here's the next thing, here's the next thing. And we do it over time so that people can keep feeling engaged. And when they're ready to purchase, they can make a purchase. They know there's an avenue to that. If they do have questions, they can also reach out to our team for other support questions. Like before they're even a member, they can say like, hey, I'm considering this thing. So we're trying to make sure that people have this level of support from just being part of our newsletter or our email funnel, as opposed to saying like, cool, well, you're not a customer yet. It's like you're a customer. As soon as you start engaging with our content, you're sort of like part of the ecosystem. You're part of Levels.
You mentioned one tool there. What other tools you got? Let's, forget about HubSpot and, the ones that everyone's going to know about. Are there any maybe up and coming tools that aren't widely being used, aren't widely being adopted that you and the Levels team are using?
Why don't I just sort of walk you through our stack a little bit? Because we got this like maniacal way of working, being an entirely remote company. So we use Loom for basically everything for communication, because we're very async in the way we communicate. But if you're putting together a campaign, you might use Loom for that. You might respond to somebody's message. We built our own communications platform too, so we don't communicate through email or through Slack. We only use our own platform. It's called Comms, comms.day if anyone wants to check it out. But that's sort of on the communication side of things. And then on the campaign creation side of things, like we use Notion for our project docs. We use Canva for putting together assets. And like if we're doing some performance marketing assets, when we rarely do them, we'll do that. We'll use Framer for landing pages, Drip for Lifecycle, mentioned PostHog for analytics. And that's pretty much it. Premiere Pro for cutting video. But in general, it's Later's a good one that we use. Later and Sprout Social. So Later is just like making sure we've got our distribution tight. Sprout Social on all the analytics for social. But between all those tools, those sort of give us the building blocks at our fingertips. And then everybody on the team is well versed in those so that they can make sure that they know how to like jump into any tool at any time. Like if somebody needs some dashboard created in PostHog, it's like, they're not like, oh, hey, Billy, can you go and do this? They just go and do it. Same thing with Canva. And again, you get people with different levels of depth in any platform. And that's where everyone tries to bring each other along, where it's like, back to Loom, you'll see somebody doing something in a Loom and you're like, oh, I noticed you doing this thing. Like, this is the better way of doing it. Here's a shortcut, or here's like how to create better padding when you're setting up this asset in Canva. And just by doing that, that's the advantage of creating this transparency, but also having everybody well-versed in these tools, is that they just keep getting better every day because everyone's trying to make each other better. So it's pretty, it's an interesting way of working.
Speaking of interesting ways of working, I know Levels has a very interesting structure with your remote assistants. Can you unpack that approach for us and tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, so our team is, we're roughly 45-ish people, 45, 46. And we've got, of those, there are 6 people on the growth team, 7, including myself. And then we as a team collectively have 21 to 22 assistants that we work with through Athena. So if people have heard of Athena, it's an incredible organization where you can have your own remote EA. And when we started working with them a couple of years ago, we threw out the misconception that an EA can only do these very transactional things, book meetings, maybe go through your inbox. But again, some people will use them, booking dinners, like just simple things. We thought like, well, if you brought on a team member, like if you hired somebody, if you're remote or not, but somebody who is part of your team, you'd feel this immense amount of responsibility to ramp them up into your organization and onboard them. And if they weren't performing well, you'd be like, there's an issue here. Anyone's only ever going to be as good as like how well you bring them into your organization, because no one comes into like any org and it's like, cool, I got this. It's like you have to learn what the playbook is, what's working, what's not. And so we decided, we're like, why wouldn't we just give all of our Athena EAs the same level of context and information transparency as we have about projects? So if we want to put together some project doc, if we want to cut video, if we want to do like daily analytics in PostHog, why would we not teach them how to do it and expect that it's going to take them some time, just like somebody who comes in and doesn't have any reference point on PostHog? It would take them time to ramp up. And so we just did this over time, and we basically turned all of our EAs into team members. So across the org, we've got these 21 or 22 EAs that we work with, and everyone basically either has their own EA or shares one. Mm-hmm. In the case of some of the engineers, they might not have full utilization for an EA. And so they'll, maybe there'll be like 2 or 3 people that share one EA. But the idea is we promote pretty vocally internally that people should be quite comfortable with delegation. And if they're not, then again, we sort of like teach each other how to be better at delegation. If somebody is like, they're not delegating, like we do a weekly report in our async updates that go out every week. And it shows how many delegations every person has on our team. So you can see if somebody's got like one delegation, it's like, well, why are you not delegating more? Because there's doubtlessly a number of things that you can get more leverage out of your time with. So by doing this, we like as a growth team, like bring it back to sort of how we work, we've been able to get everyone in the fold for distributing multimedia content, creating it, setting up like scheduling podcast interviews, coming up with like doing a full search of like future guests. So it's like you're giving them all of the same type of knowledge that you would want to have, and you just double your time or more.
Now, final question for you, since this is the Future of Consumer Marketing podcast, our final question is the big one. What is the future of consumer marketing?
Future is no secret. Future is smaller engaged audiences. I think give a hat tip to Seth Godin. He's somebody that I look up to dearly, and he wrote a book that many people are probably familiar with a number of years ago called This is Marketing. He's been talking about this concept for 20 plus years. But he concretized it in the book as people like us do things like this. And so like, what's the meaning of that? He's got TED Talk videos where he talks about the same thing. Like, why do I can't remember, I think he called it the red hat or the purple hat ladies all go to lunch together. It's people like us do things like this. So it allows people to have, you can be into motorcycles, and you can be into fishing, and you can be into football, and you can be into cross stitching and all these things. And there's going to be some overlap in the Venn diagram of all those things for like a certain cohort of people, where it's like you take all these unrelated things. When you find those people, you find the others that are like you, the messages that are out there resonate more deeply with you. So I think the future of marketing is this idea of people like us do things like this, where you're trying to cater to these smaller audiences that are so tightly knit or so tightly curated that whatever, if you can reach those audiences, and it doesn't mean that your product needs to like be the Swiss Army knife that does everything for everyone, but it's more about how do you reach those audiences and create trust with them at a foundational level, because it's these micro movements that create the greater movements in the world. So that's the thing that always sticks with me is there are these long tail pockets of the world that are so interesting, and you can see it through different YouTube channels and different content, and there's all these Discord servers, all these things exist that you're like, I had no idea there was that sort of like cohort of people in the world, but it's fascinating that it exists. And you see it's like hundreds of thousands or millions of people that are into these things that never crossed your mind. When you can reach those audiences, people like us do things like this, I think that's a future.
If there's any marketers, if there's any founders that are listening in and want to follow along with you and the Levels story, where should we send them? Where should they go?
Every platform at bgrynol, so BGRYNOL. Or if anyone has questions, I'm always happy to answer. Email ben@levels.com.